What kind of a breakdown or series of breakdowns in the medical system can lead to a setting where you have an illness and people walking into their average doctor's offices may or may not be likely to get effective treatment for it?
I would never have thought that a bacteriological infection producing the havoc that it produces can become so politicized. The truth can be so brutally distorted.
The tests for Lyme disease were developed more than a decade ago. They were controversial back then, and in all this time, no better tests have been approved, even though almost everyone agrees there are problems with the current tests.
About 50% of people who actually have Lyme disease are negative in their test results with existing methods. If you're unlucky and you have real disease, but you test negative, your disease is still real and you still require treatment.
Two groups of doctors are pitted against each other over just about every aspect of Lyme disease, from the very definition of the illness to how it should be treated.
At the present time, the traditional medical community believes that there is basically only an acute form of the disease that is characterized in a soundbite as hard to get and easy to treat. For 10 or 15 years, there has been a second group of Lyme doctors that say, no, that's not true. Lyme disease can be a persistent chronic illness with many different symptoms. So the question that is posed at the present time is, does chronic Lyme disease really exist?
Chronic Lyme disease. It's kind of the disease du jour. There's no evidence that I can find to support the concept that there is a chronic Borrelia infection after treatment. That kind of situation has been referred to as post-Lyme syndrome or post-Lyme symptoms. Those symptoms may be due to the aches and pains of kind of daily living.
The Infectious Diseases Society of America just published their Lyme disease diagnosis and treatment guidelines, and it's been a huge disaster for the Lyme disease community. They say that Lyme is easy to treat and easy to cure. They're saying that 2 weeks typically will cure most cases of Lyme. And they say that chronic Lyme doesn't exist. If people have symptoms beyond 1 2 to 4 week dose of antibiotics, they have something else, and they send them to a psychiatrist or give them some pain meds or some steroids and send them away.
If you look at the new IDSA guidelines, it's a very threatening document. It's very restrictive. So it almost was designed with a purpose in mind to restrict the treatment of Lyme.
A handful of people are pretty much the gatekeepers for information about this disease. Out of 400 references that they posted at the back of the guidelines, half of them were based on articles that the panelists or people in their labs had actually written. So it's not like they went through and looked at the whole body of Lyme research to come up with the best recommendations. They looked at a small group of articles, about half of which were written by themselves.
These guidelines are based on the best scientific evidence that from more than 25 years of study.
It completely ignores a worldwide body of literature that is in contradiction to what they're saying.
We're not going to ignore good science, but the science isn't there.
We had begun deliberations, and we were going to go over the late and chronic stage. We never got to discuss late and chronic Lyme disease. There seemed to be pressure from the IDSA to put out something, even though we couldn't agree. So what happened was, Dr. Wormser did take over the chairmanship on the guidelines for Lyme disease, and we never met again. We just said, here are the guidelines, and you can sign them and agree or not.
They're written in almost legalese terms, like this can be a document used in court cases, maybe against physicians, or maybe for insurance companies to justify cutting off treatment to their patients, because these are the guidelines.
Really, those guidelines reflected the idea of 1 or 2 people, but they've been misused by insurance companies who don't want to pay for treatments because that particular guideline says we don't know if chronic Lyme disease exists.
Some of the Lyme literate physicians feel that one can diagnose Lyme disease on clinical grounds alone, not necessarily relying on any laboratory data. And then furthermore, long-term antibiotics are the right treatment. That has never been shown in any double-blind controlled randomized trial.
I've worked here for 8 years, and I've seen many patients come and go, and I've seen the success he's had in his treatment regimen. Yes, we do treat aggressively, but I think that's what works.
In a way, it's like the perfect storm of diseases because of the timing of a couple different events in the history of medicine. 1980, the United States said it was okay for government institutions and universities to patent and profit from live organisms. So the Lyme disease organism was discovered in 1981, and all of a sudden there was the equivalent of an Oklahoma land grab, people looking under their microscopes, patenting pieces of the organism. So the people that are credited for being the Lyme disease experts no longer shared information about a new, really dangerous pathogen. They hoarded the information because they wanted to protect future profits.
You have professors, especially in the biosciences, are trying to take their discoveries, often made on the federal nickel, and take them private. They patent them, they start firms. What's commercializable is driving the research agenda in too many cases, not what's medically necessary and what's medically useful.
The other thing that happened was the rise of managed care. Insurance companies and HMOs realized that if they can get researchers in universities to define diseases and write guidelines for diseases a certain way, then they could help manage the escalating medical costs. And really what this means is the people who previously protected public health, so like the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the NIH, and universities who didn't have any commercial interests, all of a sudden they were partners with Big Pharma, and their motivations completely changed. We no longer had oversight and checks and balances in our scientific system in the US. It was rife with conflicts, and just now, 20 years later, we're beginning to see what happens when you have unchecked conflicts in medical care.
Rather than make the assumption that 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics is enough, where did anybody get that idea from in infectious disease? Tuberculosis is not treated in 2 to 4 weeks. Hepatitis, a year to treat that. HIV, indefinitely. So we're not talking about new concepts. We're talking about concepts that have not been, for whatever reason, applied.
It's really madness. You know, there's something wrong. I don't hear it in any other disease, never heard it in my life. So there's something funny. I don't know what that something funny is.
Attorney General Blumenthal of Connecticut has taken the historic move of starting an investigation into the panel members who wrote the Infectious Diseases Society of America Lyme treatment guidelines. He believes that they have conflicts that may be corrupting their advice.
Our investigation concerns whether the antitrust laws have been violated, purposefully or not, by these guidelines. They may restrict consumer choice with tremendous implications, not only for patient care, but also the economics of insurance coverage.
Ideally, authors of medical guidelines should have no financial conflicts when they make their recommendations. But if you look at the current IDSA guidelines authors, 6 of 14 of them or their universities hold patents associated with Lyme disease or its co-infections. 4 of the 14 have received funding from Lyme or co-infection test kit manufacturers. 4 have been paid by insurance companies to write Lyme policy guidelines or serve as consultants in legal cases.
And 9 of the 14 authors or their universities have received money from Lyme disease vaccine manufacturers.
The fact that 9 out of 14 authors have a direct conflict of interest with somebody who's involved in manufacturing products for any aspect of the disease is completely outrageous. The Infectious Disease Society of America should establish a hard and fast rule that the people who serve on guideline writing committees not have any ties to any manufacturer that has a stake in the outcome of those guidelines. Period. End of story.
There are a lot of people in the academic community, I think, that know these people are wrong, but no one will speak up. So, at what point will people say the emperor has no clothes? When will the voice of the people finally reach a level where the truth will come out? I mean, I think the truth will eventually come out, but how many more people are going to suffer before the truth comes out?
As citizens, we ought to be astonished and alarmed.
Every year, it is thousands and thousands of people suffering.
This is a total disgrace. Right to the IDSA. Chronic Lyme disease exists.
What has happened in Lyme disease, I think, is really uncommon in a way. Research has been very insular. It's a really tiny group of people. The IDSA, there's like 5 people. They sit on most of the editorial boards, and they are involved in most of the grant-making decisions. Open science only exists when you have competing viewpoints being in the same arena. It doesn't work when you exclude other people who think differently from you.
The story of Lyme disease has been that the public health response has blown in the direction of the big money. Healthcare is seen as an industry, not as a compassionate response for ill people. We believe ourselves to be a democratic society, but the facts are we're getting less and less democratic all the time, and the wind is blowing more and more in the direction of the big money.
It's become apparent to me that the lie is too big to confess. This is an insidious, progressive, highly debilitating illness which robs people of their lives, their souls, their ability to function. These sins committed are so great and so ugly and so large that it can't be negotiated out. So the lie is too big to confess at this point.
The controversy in Lyme disease is a shameful affair because the whole thing is politically tainted. Money goes to people that have, for the past 30 years, produced the same thing. Nothing.